Thank you very much, Alex, for joining me on the podcast.
It's great to be here, Abhishek. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. May Contain Lies, the one that is just out, the latest book of yours, How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It. The first thought that crossed my mind, Alex, when I read the title and later the book, is one thing is about how statistics are doctored in a manner that suit the agenda of the person pitching them. Like, for instance, you torture data long enough and it'll confess to anything or some such. And we live in a world where folks are actually manufacturing data to suit their agenda as well. Now, the book is a timely reminder of having to fact check pretty much everything you read. What was the intention with which you wrote it? What was the start? What was the pitch to the publisher? What did you set out to achieve?
It's to get people to think more critically and in a more discerning way. So we live in a world now where we have lots of information easily accessible. So we can just call up a study just on our iPhone or just by Googling in our browser. We can get evidence on any topic that we want to. But often the evidence that we will get is evidence that supports our viewpoint. So if I wanted an excuse to drink lots of red wine this evening, I could Google why red wine increases lifespan. I'm sure I'd find a study which shows that. So what I wanted to highlight is that what matters is not just does evidence exist, but what is the quality of the evidence, and to get the reader to be much more discerning. Is something correlation rather than causation? Is that correlation something which was lucky to begin with? Are they measuring things in the correct way? So I wanted to get people who might not be versed in statistics and might not find statistics interesting to be excited about this topic. I put a lot of work into trying to make this jargon-free, accessible, fun to read, and to explain how an everyday person without a lot of time on their hands can still be discerning, and we don't need to accept everything that we're being told.
Let me illustrate that with an example. The user-friendly aspect of it. It does not have jargons. It does not have complicated, or rather, not a single equation in the book is what you also write. And one of them is you write about how facts themselves are not good enough. Meaning you give an example of a penalty in a football game where if you're supporting two different teams, you see the same footage. And coincidentally, this happened, Southampton versus Liverpool, only 3 or 4 weeks back, where Southampton was awarded a penalty in the Premier League, which Liverpool went on to win. But I support Liverpool, so I saw it from their standpoint. Why is that? Why can't it be black and white? The same goes in cricket, which I follow more, where you always debate about whether a catch was grounded or it was indeed taken, and you're looking at the same thing.
I think this is really important because what it highlights is that just getting the facts right is not enough, because even if people can see the same facts, they have different interpretations. So often people might think, well, why do I need to read this book on misinformation? Don't I already know misinformation? It's about checking the facts. We knew since 2016, that was the year that post-truth was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year, that we need to check the facts. But my point is, even if the facts are accurate, even if we see the same facts, we may interpret them differently because of our biases. So it could be we see the same football game and then one set of fans thinks it's a penalty and somebody else doesn't. Or we might see the same fact of, let's say, a diverse company performs better. Now, one interpretation is diversity caused that better performance, and so a diversity advocate would argue that. Another interpretation was that better performance led to more diversity. So once a company is already performing well, then it can afford to invest in diversity initiatives. And those are two valid interpretations of the same data, but they have very different implications for whether diversity is a good thing or not. So it's more than just checking the facts. That's obviously important, but I wanted to talk about not misinformation 101, but misinformation the second level, which might be that we latch onto whatever interpretation we want to be true.
And you talk about your own personal experience, don't you, during your stint as a banker, when you had to put through a presentation overnight.
Yeah, so that's a great example. I appreciate you bringing it up. So let me explain the example. So when I was a junior investment banker at Morgan Stanley, so you would pitch an idea, and at the end, you'd always have a section called Morgan Stanley Credentials, explaining why they should do it with Morgan Stanley, not one of our competitors. And they always have league tables, and those league tables will show Morgan Stanley was number one in M&A, mergers and acquisitions. And Morgan Stanley would always be number one. Why? Because if we came up with a league table where Morgan Stanley was not number one, your boss would say, well, can you redo this? Can you look at the past 5 years, not the past 3 years? Or can you look at global deals, not just European deals? Or could you exclude deals below 100 million in value? So the actual table that we end up presenting is completely 100% accurate. We haven't made up the data. Those tables are absolutely right given the last 5 years and given looking at global deals. But it's misleading because there's lots of other constellations where you were not number one. And so this is really important because, again, this suggests that it goes beyond just checking the facts. And also it means that misinformation is quite difficult to police. So often people think, well, shouldn't the government prosecute people for giving misinformation? But we were not giving any misinformation. That what we were presenting was 100% accurate, but what we were not presenting were all of the different configurations. So again, this means that given we can't rely on other people like the government to prevent misinformation, what we need is the reader themselves to ask questions. So the goal of the book is to empower the reader and give you questions to ask yourself. So if somebody shows you a league table, then ask, well, what have you measured this over the past 5 years or the past 2 years, or what have you looked globally rather than just in Europe? So simple questions. And again, these are not questions about standard errors or statistical pyrotechnics. These are simple common sense questions that anybody can ask about something which is important to them when they're given some information.
And you go one step ahead. For me, as a reader, what I thought was when somebody is writing a book, it could be, let's say, a neurosurgeon, for example. I will not bother fact checking that because I think he's an expert. Or let's say the New York Times is writing an article. I would think the fact checking team would have done the relevant homework. But it may not always be the case. You encourage your readers to go and check a couple of things that have been written because the author might come with a bias and put the data that suits his or her opinion or point of view. Could you give a couple of examples where this might be the case?
Yeah, so what I'm highlighting is, unfortunately, you can't trust the author. So we'd love to live in a world where you can trust that the author has done his or her research, but that's not correct because the author has not the incentive to produce truth. They have the incentive to produce what sells. And so what sells is something that people want to hear. So there's loads of books out there where people are giving a message that people want to be true. So one example could be the second most viewed TED Talk of all the time by Amy Cuddy, Your Body Language Shapes Who You Are, which argues that in a difficult interpersonal situation, you can do a power pose, so you can put your hands up in a victory salute, and that's something where that injects some endorphins in the body and then you perform better. Now, we want that to be true. Why? Because we want to believe that we can take charge of our life, but the evidence that this was based on was extremely flimsy and has actually been debunked and overturned. More recently, there's a best-selling book called Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker, who highlights on the front cover how he's a doctor. He makes sure that you know that. And so he presents lots of evidence as to why sleep is good for you. And we want that to be true. We want an excuse to spend an extra hour in bed. We hope to believe that our over-eager beaver colleagues who get up at 5 a.m., they will meet their comeuppance. And he shows this chart, which shows that the more you sleep, the lower the chance of injury. Now that kind of makes sense, because if you're sleep deprived, you might walk into the wall. But actually, he cuts out part of the chart, because the original study that he quotes from actually shows that if you sleep for 5 hours a night, you have fewer injuries than 6 hours and fewer injuries than 7 hours, but that doesn't support what he wants to be true, so he just cuts it out. And so again, what he actually showed you was, strictly speaking, not misinformation, but he had cherry-picked and selectively quoted anything that would support his viewpoint, which is to give the message, you need to sleep as much as possible, and that's a message that people lap up, which is why his book has become so successful.
And the sad part is that the readers, despite knowing the fact, or the listeners of the TED Talk, for instance, will still want to go with it because it's a feel-good story then. The body language, I think you write that they changed the headline of that YouTube video by saying body language may help you do certain things rather than that it will indeed help you with those things. But that hasn't stopped it from being popular. So the burden of responsibility is also with the consumer, but we are okay to not let truth come in the way of a fancy story then.
Yes, and what's interesting is what happens when when bad research has been overturned. People don't change their viewpoint because they've already anchored on the old view. So let's say you believe in power posing, and then let's say people found that, well, the evidence did not work, is actually been debunked. Then somebody might say, well, I've tried power posing and it works for me. And so they might say, well, my personal experience is that power posing has worked. And even if it didn't actually work, you want to feel that you did something and it had an effect. Just like if I was to attend somebody's time management seminar, if I spent 4 hours driving to the seminar and spent £1,000 to attend that seminar, I will try and claim, yes, that did improve my time management. And similarly, somebody who starts doing power posing, they will try to claim that this led to some positive effects. And so even if there's evidence which suggests that it's no longer true, people will say, well, I don't believe that evidence because I've seen it from my own eyes. But you have a very selective perception of your own experience.
And then I've attended a few seminars on leadership independently, and oftentimes the speaker will fib through their teeth to make a point of their own, and they are good, well-intentioned people. Maybe they've heard something from someone. Like, for example, not too long ago someone said that we use only 10% of our brains, and I don't believe artificial intelligence will take over the world. And I was reading this book by Bill Bryson on the human body, and I quote, it says, incidentally, the idea that we use only 10% of our brain is a myth. No one knows where the idea came from, and it has never been closed to be true. But the entire audience nodded when the speaker said that. And is that something that needs to change on our side as well then?
Yeah, so what you're explaining is what's known as the illusory truth effect, where if something is repeated loads and loads of times, even if it's baseless, people think it's true. So if Donald Trump keeps saying, well, the election was stolen from me, then even in the absence of actually proof that that happened, if it's just repeated enough times, then people think it is true. And so this may be the same as the idea of the 10% of your brain. So again, this is why what I try and encourage is, well, just to check the underlying source, is to check the underlying facts. Just like with the sleep chart, go to the underlying source and see what the underlying growth graph said. It was very different from what was presented in the book. Now, you would obviously be at your wit's end if you had to check everything against the underlying source. So you have to apply the 80-20 principle. So the most important things to you, you'll check them. But if it's something where there's not a real consequence to it, then it may well be that you just let that one slide. But there are many, many things that people think to be true that when you ask them, when you actually look behind the curtain, you find that, well, there is actually no evidence behind it. So people just seem to have have just quoted it, and because everybody else has quoted, you think that to be true. So I give an example in the book of the 10,000 hours rule, which was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, the idea that if you spend 10,000 hours on something, you'll become an expert. Now, everybody believes in this 10,000 hours rule, and when I've mentioned it myself, people have nodded away, just like people nodded to the 10% of your brain idea. But it was only when I looked at the underlying evidence that Malcolm Gladwell quotes, that evidence shows nothing like a 10,000 hours rule. So Gladwell claimed it supported his rule, and his rule became extremely famous. He sold lots of books, but the actual evidence behind this does not support anything close to that rule.
I've got a 6-year-old, and I've used that example a few times that, you have to put in 10,000. So he's learning how to play the keyboard. But the idea is we are trying to instill the idea of discipline or practice.
Yeah, so why do people just believe in the 10,000 hours rules? Is it strikes a chord with our values. So we tell our children, practice makes perfect. You can do anything you put your mind to. And so when there is apparent evidence or proof that you can develop anything if you just try hard enough, we love that to be true. And it seems empowering. It means that we're not a slave to our genetics or our upbringing. As long as we try hard enough, we will be able to be successful. And you might think, well, isn't that just a good message to give to our children, to give to anybody? Does it matter that the evidence isn't actually there if it encourages people to practice and try hard? And I do think evidence matters. Why? Because firstly, the 10,000 hours rule suggests that you can try anything, when there was an example that I give in the book of somebody who wanted to become a professional golfer without any natural talent behind this. And so it doesn't matter how much time you put in or how passionate you are, you do need talent as well. And I know that's unpopular because people like to say, well, there's a talent myth, talent doesn't matter. But no matter how much I try, I would never become a professional footballer for England, or I'm not going to become a pop star, no matter how much I love music. Number two is it focuses on the number of hours that you put in, not actually the quality of practice. So Malcolm Gladwell gives the idea of how the Beatles became so successful as they just had long jam sessions. But the actual underlying research shows that what matters is actually deliberate practice. So he deliberately says jam sessions don't count as practice. This is just difficult practice sessions guided by a coach. It may well be if you're trying to practice public speaking, you have to record yourself, watch yourself afterwards, which people find quite unnerving, and try to focus on particular points to improve. So it's not just rehearsing and going through the motions and repeating something. It is expert practice guided by a coach, and that's very different to what sometimes people interpret the 10,000 hours rule as, which is just put in some hours.
You also write about a study or a line by McKinsey. If you could, I'm trying to scratch my brain what the exact line was, where it says that resilient companies go on to achieve certain things. Could you help me out there?
Yeah, so there was a study by McKinsey claiming that resilience leads to outperformance. So more resilient organizations outperform. And we love that to be true. We love resilience as a character trait. We think we want gritty, determined people. And that might be something where on the back of it, then people start to hire McKinsey on how to make my organization more resilient. But let's look at the data. So they claimed more resilient companies have higher sales, I think. But how did they define resilient? More resilient companies were the ones with the highest stock price growth to begin with. Now, stock price growth and sales are extremely highly correlated. So the better the sales, the better your stock price growth will be. So it's about just like saying football teams that score more goals win more games. Well that's obvious. Right. So resilience, claiming that resilient companies outperform. Well, resilience was defined as companies that outperform to begin with. And so this shows nothing about resilience mattering. It just shows that successful companies are successful. But again, people who don't look beyond this, they think, oh, resilience, that's a great trait. They don't see how resilience was measured. And so they want to then hire McKinsey to make their organizations more resilient.
Because these are articles that are the top, that any top management of an organization might forward it to their vice presidents, and they have to just lap it up because it's coming from the top. If McKinsey has done its homework, assumption is that everything would be great. But you suggest that we need to question these things to the extent possible. How do we go about it? What are some of the, ways in which, without going to that PDF document, going to the third page and reading that long-winded text, it'll be too difficult for us as laypersons. What do we do if we have to spot what Matthew Walker did in the book, such that we are better off for it?
Well, I think the first thing, if you don't want to actually look at the statistics yourself, maybe because it just takes too long or that's not your expertise, look at the authors. So look at two things about the authors: their credentials and their bias. So with McKinsey, they're a great management consulting organization. They can go into a company and suggest how it can improve itself. But that is very different from conducting research of the link between, say, resilience and company performance. That requires scientific methodology. That's something that business school professors do, who understand correlation versus causation. That is very different to actually troubleshooting a company. And similarly with Dr. Matthew Walker, he claims that he got his PhD from the prestigious Medical Research Council of the UK, but there's no such body that grants PhDs. So he basically misrepresents his credentials. I think he claimed to be like a tenured professor at Harvard when he was not. So his actual credentials are misstated. Second is their bias. And to ask yourselves, would the authors have released a study with the opposite result? So, would McKinsey ever release a study claiming that resilient companies do worse? Probably not. And would Matthew Walker ever say, well, actually, there's downsides to too much sleep? No, because he's known as the sleep consultant. Whereas there are many cases in which academics release papers where they would have released the opposite. So there are many papers showing that diversity does not improve financial performance. And I think those should be taken seriously because the authors don't have any interest in finding that. It would become a much more successful paper had they found the opposite. And had they found the opposite, they would have released the paper as well. And so if you're presenting something with a slightly uncomfortable result, then it may well be that that's just because what the data shows rather than because you want it to be true. Now, even if the authors like the result, so even if the sleep expert finds that sleep is good for you, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. Sometimes things we want to be true are actually true, but it does mean that we want to be a bit more discerning because there's the concern of cherry picking.
Right, and is this all getting exacerbated because we live in a world of social media where there is hardly a concept of an unexpressed thought? If I read something, I'd like to share it with a friend of mine. Is social media playing a pretty toxic role, or it's just that we are careless with the way we share things?
It does play a big role. So social media affects what we see, and what we see is what we want to be true. Why? Because how do social media companies make money? They by keeping your eyes on screens. And if they know that, let's say, somebody's a climate change denier, they will feed him or her lots of stories saying that climate change is a hoax. So what we see is not necessarily what's true, but what we want to be true. And this leads to just a big echo chamber. Also, who can publish something on social media? Anybody. So you don't need to be an expert, and as long as what you say taps into people's biases, it can go viral. So I believe on TikTok there's a series of videos claiming that sunscreen is a massive conspiracy. There's no risk of skin cancer. Sunscreen doesn't help you. Actually, sunscreen worsens your skin. And to people who don't believe in big pharma and think that companies are evil, they lap this up and believe this. And this can be really damaging, is that then young children go out and they don't wear sun protection. So this is contrasting within the past. Where were our sources of information? For health advice, you didn't go to TikTok, you went to a doctor. And only qualified people would be a practicing doctor. And if you wanted to read about some facts, you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, and again, only qualified people can write there. Whereas nowadays, anybody can write anything, and this means that what we see is sometimes what we want to hear rather than what's actually true. So Malcolm Gladwell is not an expert on what drives performance. Simon Sinek, so he's writing a lot of books about what drives business success. He's not run any business. He's not an executive. He's not a business school professor who studied the success of business. He's just a random punter who came up with this idea of some model of starting with why and then selectively found some companies to support that viewpoint.
Does that frustrate you as somebody who spends his life behind numbers, and how do you deal with this when somebody gets away by just telling a good story because without the facts in place? And of course, your book is one medium through which you get your message out, but how do you deal with it as somebody who has this very close to your heart?
So it does frustrate me. So why does it frustrate me? So I can honestly say it doesn't frustrate me because of envy, that I think, oh, this guy sold a lot of books and therefore makes lots of money. Because there's many people who may win the lottery or reality TV, and I'm not envious of them. But it leads to then misinformation of people running companies. Think all we need to do is come up with a why or a purpose statement, and then this, if it doesn't work, then it actually is not going to be improving companies' performance. So my concern is not that sort of Simon Sinek gets wealthy based on selling fluff, but it's based on if people act in accordance with what he's suggesting and therefore they don't run companies as efficiently as they might do otherwise, then this is really bad for the productivity of the economy, for job creation, for products and customer service and so on. So what then I do about it, I do then need to speak out and constructively and professionally, but also clearly and firmly say, well, actually some of these studies are weaker than what we would like to be true. And notice that sometimes the studies that I highlight issues with are studies I myself would love to be true. So my first book, Grow the Pie, was on the importance of a company having a purpose. Now that sounds pretty much like having a why. So I would love Simon Sinek to have conclusively proven that having a why leads to success, because then that would buttress my idea that having a purpose leads to success. But that is just not true. It's not backed up by any of the data that he shows, which is just a couple of cherry-picked anecdotes. So the reason why I'm calling this out is I am somebody who's looked at this topic in a lot of detail. I know that this is an issue where the data is weak, and also if I am to call this out, people know that it's not ideological. So if you had, say, an anti-woke person calling out the problems with sustainability or purpose, people might say, well, that's because they are very right-wing. For me, I'm somebody who absolutely believes in the importance of sustainability. So if I indeed highlight issues with this, then it's not due to ideological bias. It is just indeed due to the evidence not being as strong as people claim.
And has it ever happened in the recent past or as far back as you can remember where one of your views, you've seen yourself change despite you having been on the other side with a person, whether it's a debate? Because these days it's quite rare. Oftentimes we are rooted in our point of view that we don't change despite enough evidence. Have you seen yourself change a position that you can think of where you said, I didn't see it that way, and probably you might be right?
Yes, I have, and many times. So one of the issues with me writing a book about confirmation bias is I need to be aware of my own biases and to be willing to admit that I'm wrong, and I am wrong on many occasions. And in the book, I acknowledge the times that I was wrong. One example was the 10,000 hours rule. So I used to teach this to my students. So at the end of my finance course, my final lecture, many faculty give like a last lecture thing where they talk about just general life and career advice. And I talked about the 10,000 hours rule. So I always taught at the start of the MBA. And then I said, well, for the next 2 years in your MBA, push yourself out of your comfort zone, try something new, because of this 10,000 hours rule, it might mean that you don't believe you're a master negotiator, but take negotiation classes and improve on that dimension. And it was only later that when I actually had to study the evidence in detail for a separate talk that I was giving, that I realized it was much weaker, and then now I no longer teach this anymore. Another issue was Brexit. So in 2016, the UK was voting to leave the European Union, and I was a very strong Remainer. I believe that the UK absolutely and no doubt should remain in the UK, and I thought that in the EU, and that anybody who thought differently was racist or xenophobic or just didn't understand basic economics. And then I went to some Brexit talks by some leading Brexiteers, and I realised that they had very good arguments. So even if I didn't agree with their conclusion, I saw the logic behind what they were saying. And this was very different to what I was led to believe, which is Brexiters were just don't like foreigners, they don't like immigrants, or they complain about the European Union placing rules on the curvature of bananas. No, they were not on petty things like that. They said, no, we want to be open to immigration, but there's no reason for us to be more biased towards immigration from the EU than immigration from, say, Asia or Latin America. So even though I still voted for Remain, when the vote happened, I was not one of the many people arguing for a second referendum and saying, well, no, this was something won based on misinformation. I believe there were reasonable arguments for why the UK should leave the European Union. I personally did not agree with those arguments, but I could see there was logic behind them, and I wanted to accept the democratic will of the people, even though that democratic will was against how I myself voted.
Last couple of questions. I know we are almost running out of time. One of the stories that you talk about is that of JFK back in the day, when he, as a leader, and pretty much stopped the Third World War by getting diverse opinions in the room rather than just cherry picking advice from people who had been there for a long time.
Yeah, so this was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where some missiles were being spotted in Cuba being installed, and so JFK had to decide, well, what to do about this. And just before that crisis, there was the Bay of Pigs disaster, where they launched this failed invasion to Cuba, which was extremely costly, extremely unsuccessful. And so he wanted to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So first, well, why was there the Bay of Pigs disaster? Because of a phenomenon which is now known as groupthink, where people all think the same way. And so what JFK wanted to do to respond to the Cuban Missile Crisis was to bring in diversity. But by diversity, this is not what people typically think diversity means, which is just a mix of men and women and different races or sexual orientations or ethnicities and so on, that is not unimportant. But what really matters is cognitive diversity, is do people actually think differently? So with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was just a group of white men. This was about 60 years ago, but there were some who were very for military action. They were military leaders, and there were some who were skeptical about military action. And so it's important to have people who think different ways, just to have both men and women, or whites and non-whites who all are for military action. That's not something which is going to be helpful. And so let's think about it, say a business decision. If the group of people that you have are all optimists who always see the upside to a potential new strategy, you want to bring in some pessimists as well. So because people who are always looking at what could go wrong and who are going to have brakes, like a great car has an accelerator pedal and a brake pedal. What matters isn't that they're both coloured black, is that they do different things. And we often will look at superficial measures of diversity rather than what matters is diversity of thinking. Also, what matters is not just bringing in a diverse mix of people, but also making sure that they have the time and space to express their different viewpoints. And so one issue with groupthink is that if you're on a board, you want to be collegial, and to many people being collegial means agreeing with everything that people say. To be challenging is sometimes difficult, and sometimes people don't like that challenge, but we should be very open towards challenges and actually try to welcome them.
And I think JFK, you're right, that he also didn't attend some of those meetings. He wanted to get out of the way so that they don't get influenced by what he thinks. And you've got another example of, I love this one, and it was hilarious, Alfred Sloan.
Yeah, so Alfred Sloan ran General Motors, and then he closed a meeting with a new initiative, and he says, oh, does anybody disagree with me? Nobody disagreed. And then he said, well, then I'm going to postpone the decision until the next meeting so that you can have the chance to disagree with me. And so I thought that's great, because that suggests that that helped not just in that particular decision, but it also meant the general culture that he wanted to build was one in which people disagreed with him. So he knew that, yes, he's the CEO of the organization, but not every decision that he would make would be 100% accurate. And so if nobody disagreed with him, it's not because his decision was flawless, it's that there probably are flaws, but nobody had the time to think about them. So he gave time and space for people to come up with flaws with that particular decision, but beyond that particular decision, he conveyed that the culture he wanted to build was one in which people were just disagreeing with him, and those are the people that he valued, not just yes men and yes women.
Lovely. I think in the interest of time, Alex, thank you very much for your time on this one. Beautiful book, loved it. Would request the listeners to also pick this one up, because I think you ruffle a few feathers in there as well. And there is enough. The appendix also has a lot of links if somebody wants to dig deeper for them to know where you picked that up from. So thank you very much again, Alex, for your time on this podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for your kind words, and thank you for sharing my work with your listeners. It's great to be here.
Thank you.